my talk is going to be a kind of primer on EEF1A2 related neurodevelopmental disorder. It's partly to bring everyone up to speed because, as I said, we have a mixed audience. So some people will be quite familiar already. And it's also partly to give some background on the science behind it all. So the official name is EEF1A2 related neurodevelopmental disorder, but that's quite wordy. So I'm going to call it EEF1A2 syndrome from now on, just for the sake of being brief. And because that's a name that some people are already familiar with. So EEF1A2 syndrome is a condition that typically causes epilepsy or seizures, developmental delay, and intellectual disability. And one key feature of this condition is that it's very variable, so it can range from being quite mild to very severe. So, for example, most children who are affected, but not all, will start to have seizures within the first 4 months after birth, but this can start later on as well. Some people will respond really well to treatment with standard anti-seizure medications, but in other cases, the seizures can be more difficult to control. There can be problems with movement that range from low muscle tone, coordination issues, all the way to being unable to walk or to sit up. And some people who are affected might be non-verbal, while others communicate in sentences or with signs. So each person who's affected might have a very different experience of the condition. So it's a very rare condition. We know of about 200 cases worldwide, and we hear about these both through published scientific papers and case studies, and then we also hear about diagnoses through personal communication. So, for example, we hear about things through the support group or by emails to the lab. But there was one paper that was published fairly recently that estimated that this condition occurs just under 3 times per every 100,000 births. So, although that's still a very small number, it's more than the cases that we already know about might suggest. We've only known about EEF1A2 syndrome since 2012, so this is still a relatively new condition in that sense. And many of the people that we know of who are affected are children. But we suspect that there are probably a lot of adults who might have been diagnosed with epilepsy or intellectual disability well before 2012 or have a kind of milder presentation who never had a genetic test and so were never diagnosed with EEF1A2 syndrome. And although there's been a lot of progress with people receiving genetic diagnoses over the last few years, that's mostly been in paediatric settings in children. But we are hearing about new cases all the time as genetic testing becomes more affordable and accessible. So this condition has quite a mouthful of a name, so I thought I would tell you about what EEF1A2 actually is. But first, I just want to go over some biology terms so that everyone is on the same page. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. Oh, oh, sorry. So firstly, the cells are the fundamental unit of human life. There are over 200 different types in the human body, and they make up all of our different organs and tissues. They perform different functions, and those cells can look very different from each other. Cells are made up of proteins. Proteins can act alone or bind to one, two, or many others to form larger structures. Proteins themselves are made up of amino acids. They're the base components out of which all proteins are constructed. And DNA is like the cell's instruction book for making new proteins. It contains the code for every protein that's required by every type of cell, so which amino acids the protein is made of and what order they need to be arranged in. Part of what allows cells to have all these different structures and functions is by having the code for different proteins turned on or off. And when we talk about genes, we're referring to just sections of DNA that code for different things. So by following the instructions encoded in DNA, cells can create any new protein that they need. And the process of making new proteins in a cell is called translation. Sorry about that. So the amino acids are assembled into the correct order, following the instructions encoded in DNA, and then they're folded up into a three-dimensional structure. And all cells are completely dependent on the process of translation for survival and for normal function. Sorry, my slides are just not changing. There we go. So now I can tell you that the gene EEF1A2 codes for the protein EEF1A2 with a small e, which is why you might see these written differently if you're reading about it online. The protein EEF1A2 isn't made in every cell in the body, but only in a specific few types. It's found in the neurons, which are nerve cells that send signals all over the body that control everything from breathing, talking, walking, and thinking. It's also found in the skeletal muscle cells, which are what you think of when you think about muscles, your biceps, your quads and abs, and the slightly different cardiac muscle that makes up your heart. But what does EEF1A2 actually do? Well, it's a translation factor, and that means that it plays a really important role in that process of translation of making new proteins. And the interesting thing is that a very similar but slightly different protein called EEF1A1 does this job in every other cell type in the body. And that suggests there's something special about EEF1A2 that we need in the nerve and muscle cells specifically, but we still don't fully understand what that is. But what we do know is that EEF1A2 is vital for survival and for normal function. So EEF1A2 syndrome itself is caused by harmful changes in the DNA that codes for the protein EEF1A2. And each of the mutations that cause this condition change just a single one of the amino acids out of the nearly 500 that make up the EEF1A2 protein. In almost every case, these mutations are de novo, and that means that they weren't passed down from an affected parent, but they've happened spontaneously in an egg or a sperm cell. And that means that the chances of future children of the same parents having the same condition is really low. So you may have seen this kind of notation before in relation to an EEF1A2 diagnosis. And this is just a way of describing a genetic mutation by explaining what has changed either in the DNA or the protein. So the numbers represent the position of the change and the letters tell us what has been changed. So in this case, a change in the DNA code on the first line means that the correct amino acid, glycine, which is number 70 of the amino acids in the sequence, has instead been replaced by a different one called serine, which is where we get G70S. This means that the protein then gets made containing a mistake that might affect how it functions. So these two codes represent the same end result, but they just describe it at different levels, one at the DNA level and one at the protein level. So we do have a clear understanding of what's being changed in the DNA and the protein, but what we're still trying to understand is how exactly the different genetic mutations actually affect the way that EEF1A2 works. So I mentioned earlier that it's a very variable condition with a really wide range in severity, and we think that that's partly because there are many different mutations that have been found in people with EEF1A2 syndrome. There's over 50 different mutations in only around 200 people, and some are more common than others, which means that quite a few of these mutations are only occurring in one person in the whole world. And that means that it's very difficult to predict how someone will be affected without understanding exactly what that mutation is doing to EEF1A2. So you might have seen this analogy before if you've looked at Kathy's website at all, but we each have two copies of the gene that makes EEF1A2 that we need to keep us healthy. But it can help if instead of thinking about genes, we imagine that we need 2 doses of EEF1A2 every day to keep us healthy and stop us from getting seizures or epilepsy. So if you picture 2 pills that contain the correct amount of EEF1A2, one is not enough. We need both doses a day. So now if you imagine what happens if you have a mutation in one copy of EEF1A2, you still get 1 dose per day that works well, which is the normal copy of the gene that produces the right amount of functional EEF1A2, but then the other capsule isn't quite right. So some people might have a mutation that means although they're still getting 1 normal dose of EEF1A2, the second dose isn't enough, and that's what we would call a loss of function mutation. So that means that they don't have quite enough EEF1A2 to keep them healthy and prevent epilepsy. And in this case, their symptoms are only caused by the lack of EEF1A2, by not having enough. Other people might have a mutation, which means that they have the right amount of EEF1A2 in their second dose, but it's not quite the right drug. So in this case, not only is the person not getting enough EEF1A2 from their single healthy dose, but the mutations mean that the EEF1A2 in their second dose could be toxic and actively harmful to the nerve and muscle cells. And we call this a gain of function mutation. And in this case, the person can have a kind of additive stacking effect of both having a lower dose than they need to stay healthy, combined with the harm caused by the mutated EEF1A2. So there are lots of different variations of this scenario, different combinations of loss and gain of function, and different ways that EEF1A2 might be affected. So, for example, EEF1A2 needs to be able to interact with other proteins to do its job. Mutations can affect protein interactions in more than one way. So it could sit on an area of EEF1A2 where it interacts with another protein and it either partially or completely stops this from happening. And then that could stop EEF1A2 from being able to carry out its normal functions. It's even possible that a mutation could allow EEF1A2 to bind to a new protein that it previously couldn't interact with, and that might allow new functions which could potentially be harmful. Oh, my slides are jammed. And mutations in EEF1A2 could prevent it from correctly folding into its final protein structure after all the amino acids have been assembled, maybe making it unstable or making it clump together, which can be damaging. So there are multiple different ways that EEF1A2 could be affected by mutations. And then these effects of EEF1A2 inside the cells then have wider impacts on bigger systems like the brain, nervous system, and muscle function. And that leads to the symptoms that we see, like seizures. So a lot of research is devoted to understanding exactly how mutations translate into symptoms, because we hope that there's some way of correcting that or to compensate for it and to improve people's symptoms. And so the ultimate goal of this kind of research is to find treatments or even potentially a cure for EEF1A2 syndrome down the line. But at the moment, there is no cure for EEF1A2 syndrome, and instead the symptoms are typically treated or managed individually. So, for example, epilepsy can sometimes be managed using anti-seizure medication, and other therapies such as physical or speech therapy can be used to improve movement and communication. Sometimes medications for other symptoms are prescribed, like sleep or gastrointestinal problems. And people who are affected can be supported with the use of things like communication or mobility aids as well. But overall, the response to treatment is also very varied, and what works well for one person might not suit another person. So a really individual approach is usually needed for finding the best treatments for someone with EEF1A2 syndrome. With rare conditions like this, lots of people call the search for answers a diagnostic odyssey, because it can be quite difficult to get a diagnosis. But an EEF1A2 diagnosis is confirmed by genetic testing, usually after symptoms have been noticed and there hasn't been another cause found for them. Testing is really highly recommended for people with epilepsy anyway to determine the root cause, because it can have big implications for how treatment happens. And this is most often done by taking a blood sample, but in some cases it can be done with a saliva or cheek swab. And the test is likely to be part of a panel test. It won't just be looking for EEF1A2 usually, it'll be looking for all different kinds of genetic epilepsy. But ideally, any child who has seizures or developmental delay should be considered for testing for EEF1A2, even if they are like well-controlled seizures or it's a milder presentation, because it may be the cause. So as a final note, I just want to talk about the relationship between EEF1A2 and cancer. So if you've ever searched online for EEF1A2, you might have noticed that lots of different search results about cancer will pop up, but that is not related to EEF1A2 syndrome. So EEF1A2 is supposed to be produced in nerve and muscle cells, but in some cancers, it's wrongly produced in cells that it doesn't belong in. And then that contributes to cancerous cell growth because it's making extra protein, essentially. And that's not connected to EEF1A2 syndrome or the related DNA changes. So just to summarize, EEF1A2 related neurodevelopmental disorder is a really rare genetic condition that's caused by harmful changes in the DNA that codes for the protein EEF1A2. And EEF1A2 plays a really important role in making new proteins in the cell. The condition can really vary. It can be really mild or very severe, but the typical presentation that we see is epilepsy, intellectual disability, and developmental delay to different extents. It's diagnosed by genetic testing, and although there's currently no cure, symptoms are often treated individually, but they do require a tailored approach. Thank you very much. I just want to quickly acknowledge my lab group, my supervisors and my research funders. If you have any questions, just ask them in the Q&A and I would be happy to answer them. And we'll be hearing from a few of the people on this list of lab members about what they do in the lab and the kinds of research questions that they're trying to answer. But first, Kathy will be given a talk on research challenges and opportunities for EEF182. And for those of you who don't already know Kathy, Professor Kathy Abbott is the head of a lab at the University of Edinburgh that investigates EEF182 and EEF182 syndrome.